This episode is brought to you by IndieBase, the smart, simple and budget-friendly electronic patient report system built for the realities of HEMS work and pre-hospital care. Whether you're a solo responder, part of a flexible team or working across a large organisation, IndieBase is the right solution for you. So it works on any device, laptop, tablet or smartphone, and crucially it runs offline when you need it the most. So born from trusted foundation of HEMSbase and built by the Medic One systems team, IndieBase combines a familiar intuitive interface with rock solid reliability. So from festival first aid to complex patient transport to high acuity critical care, IndieBase is ready for every pre-hospital scenario. So it integrates with all popular pre-hospital monitors and includes powerful case review and indeed clinical governance modules. So it's ideal for maintaining high standards and supporting services preparing for CQC registration. So there's also a dedicated patient feedback module, which when used alongside clinical governance supports continuous improvement and patient-centered care. So for those working across multiple organizations, IndieBase gives you a personal logbook that unifies your data and even integrates with your HEMSbase logbook. So it's quick to deploy, easy to use and built for the field. IndieBase makes electronic patient reporting simple wherever you are. So find out more at indiebase.net. That's IndieBase.net, or head to the show notes for further information. This podcast is sponsored by PAX. Whether on the water, on land or in the air, PAX bags are both versatile and flexible backpacks that are perfectly suitable for your requirements in the most demanding of environments. PAX bags are highly regarded due to their exceptional performance in pre-hospital and in critical care environments. Their well-organized compartments and customizable configurations enhance efficiency in high-stress situations. They're designed with infection control in mind and are easy to clean and disinfect. So highly visible colours and reflective strips aid quick identification and adherence to quality standards, ensuring reliability. So the versatility of PAX bags caters to diverse EMS providers, and they deliver vital equipment, durability and ease of use for pre-hospital critical care services globally. I've used PAX bags in a number of critical care situations and they're absolutely excellent, both in identification of kit but also in identification of the reflective strips to ensure visibility. So please see the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode, we're going to talk to Dr. Naomi Murphy about the complex intersection of adolescent male violence, social media's influence, and its profound impact on medical professionals responding to these incidents. So we're honoured to be joined by Dr. Naomi Murphy, who is one of the UK's most respected forensic clinical psychologists and recently appointed Honorary Professor of Psychology at Nottingham Trent University. Naomi brings over 25 years of clinical experience working with complex trauma, particularly among young men who've experienced childhood adversity and gone on to display violent behaviour. So the rising tide of youth violence presents unique challenges for pre-hospital providers. Throughout this conversation, we're going to examine the psychological foundations of youth violence. We're going to look at how digital platforms have altered its expression and discuss the evidence-based approaches for supporting victims and medical professionals who care for them. So, Naomi's groundbreaking trauma-focused therapy offers valuable insights for emergency responders experiencing vicarious trauma. Welcome to the podcast, Naomi.
Thanks very much for inviting me on.
Just as we start, Naomi, could I get you just to really unpack initially and just explore why young adolescent males are more susceptible, really, to violence, and indeed maybe some of the drivers which cause them to be violent?
Well, I think sometimes it's easier to start by thinking about what we know kids need early on in life, and we know that the basic things that they need are safety and love. And actually, if a child feels safe and feels loved, pretty much they can cope with an awful lot of adversity, accidents, illness, all those sorts of things. If they've got at least one parent, preferably two, but at least if they've got one parent that looks after them. And I suppose my experience has been really of working with people who haven't had those experiences in childhood. So I've worked with people where things have gone wrong. So they've often been raised in families where there's been a lot of domestic violence. So they might have witnessed it or experienced physical or sexual abuse themselves. And we know that even witnessing domestic violence is as traumatizing and damaging to young people's development. And also often fear within the family home. If there's violence between the parents, then there can be, growing up in an environment where they don't feel safe. I think, when you look at the kind of teenagers that spend an awful lot of time building up their top half of their body in the gym, and you see that in adult males as well, but often those people have got a history of feeling quite scared during childhood and wanting to develop themselves and make themselves look stronger. And if you're frightened in the family home, an awful lot of effort goes into projecting yourself as more powerful than you actually feel, and that will obviously then get carried into the school, into life outside the family home. And in some ways it might be easier to present yourself as big and strong outside of the family home, and that might feel necessary if you're feeling very frightened at home. People who end up in prison for violence have often obviously had much more likely to have lived experience of the care system. And again, you're talking about environments in which kids don't feel safe by and by, and also there's an absence of love and affection. Even in a good residential care setting, it's hard for kids to feel loved within those environments. And then I think we also have factors like the need to belong, and how do you achieve status and belonging if you're in a family home where you felt scapegoated or felt like you're not deserving of love and care. Children start then looking for that outside and often gravitate towards groups of youths that they can feel a sense of acceptance and belonging in. And sadly, those kind of groups are often groups where, violence and power is a currency, and kids are expected to prove they're initiated into those gangs, they're expected to prove their power to belong, to gain acceptance into the group. And I think finally, sort of what gangs often offer to young men in particular, increasingly girls as well, but they offer a sense of role models. So the young 13-year-old boys might be looking for older male approval, a sense of acceptance and belonging, and then end up emulating these older youths who aren't the most desirable people. And my experience of working with men in the prison system is quite often their experiences have not been that dissimilar to, the stories of girls being groomed for sexual abuse in places like Rochdale and Rotherham, where they thought those men were their boyfriends and they would buy them cigarettes, give them a small amount of money, and they felt like that was a sign of their worth, a sign that they were accepted. You see a very similar parallel process with young boys, actually, that they get brought into this group of older men and are given these things in a kind of grooming process, maybe not grooming for sex, sometimes it is grooming for sex, but maybe not grooming for sex, but being groomed into this kind of subculture, which is very violent heavy.
Naomi, I wonder if you could just unpack how the unfettered access really to these platforms has maybe changed the landscape, and indeed what we're seeing within young adolescent males, and just actually how open and engaging with this content can actually increase the incidence.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I'd like to just say I'm not an expert on social media, but we are all engaged in it, I think, and I don't believe that social media causes violence. However, I do think it significantly amplifies the risk of people getting involved in violence. So the algorithms feed us information that pushes us further into a particular perspective. They quite often fuel, the clickbait element is sort of fuel hatred, fuel dislike, see people as other, see people as different, which then makes it much easier to victimize them than if we see that we have things in common. I think, the idea that I spoke about initiation, that young people, young men as well as young women, end up getting initiated into adulthood, but these groups often set young people challenges that they have to accomplish, and I think unfortunately social media often gets used as part of that recipe, you know, that they have to post video, you know, they have to be seen. In the past, it might have been enough to go and start a fight with somebody, but now that would also be expected to be filmed and placed online. And of course, that adds an extra layer of victimization for the victim. There's a humiliation of everybody seeing this video, making it very, very difficult to move on and forget that. And I think social media also plays to peacocking, you know, which teenagers are prone to anyway, you know, preening themselves, looking for approval and validation, and social media does enable that to happen. I think the area I feel most concerned actually is in terms of sexual violence, because actually most of us have some kind of understanding of the prevalence of violence, or non-sexual violence around us, and have some understanding of how that links to emotional regulation. But kids are quite often getting their ideas about sex from what they see online, and that is much more concerning, because if they haven't got safe spaces in which to bounce around ideas, ask questions, talk about things, understand the perspectives of one another, I think that's actually really quite dangerous. And even adults, I think, find themselves getting drawn into, or certainly I've worked with adults who found themselves getting drawn into more and more extreme behaviours because of the titillation that's been, you know, amplified by this process of clickbait, really, and the algorithm pushing things further and further to the extreme.
So Naomi, could I get you to really unpack what you see in practice, just really from an impact perspective on healthcare staff, from in a way from this vicarious experience consistently through time of violent crime and indeed violent injuries, and treating the result of violent crime from adolescent males?
I think anyone who's in a sort of first responder role is very, very vulnerable, because I mean, the fact is you're going into situations which are dangerous, actually, and people don't necessarily sign up to be a health professional thinking they're going to be in dangerous situations. I would argue the police might think that they're a little bit more prepared for that when they sign up, but actually, I think there's quite often comparable fear there for paramedics, and yet actually the police, because it's an explicit risk and vulnerability, they, you know, there are measures taken to try and enhance their safety. And you, as a paramedic, you presumably don't necessarily have that same level of information available. But I think what we see in first responders across the board, no matter what, whether that be paramedics, police, prison officers, fire staff, you can quite often end up with a sort of emotional detachment and switching, you know, becoming desensitized to what you're seeing, as a way to try and cope with it. And certainly working in prison, we'd, you know, I'd say we'd talk a lot about fear, and prison officers, when they first came to the unit I worked on, would say, "Oh, I don't feel frightened when I'm at work." And it's like, what? Of course you're frightened. It's a bit like, you know, when you cross the road, most people say, "Oh, I don't feel scared when I cross the road." We don't feel scared because we put in place measures. We look left, we look right, so we know we're not likely to get hit, but you wouldn't blindly step out in front of it. And I think we use an awful lot of safety behaviours to make ourselves feel safe. So we tell ourselves, well, I'm here with a colleague. This, you know, it's not, I've never been attacked before, but actually you are going into a situation where there is the possibility of attack. Then as a health professional, you're also seeing dreadful woundings, and possibly also seeing people lose their lives as a consequence of this violence. So you can end up sort of desensitized and disconnected from your own emotions, and sadly we can't just switch that on and off in certain situations. So if we're disconnecting from our emotions in order to cope with high levels of fear or revulsion or sadness as arising from our work, unfortunately, that can also end up spilling out into our personal life as well, because we don't work emotionally with an on-off switch. So if we're switching off at work, the chances are we're also then doing that at home as well. We can end up with compassion fatigue, also vicarious trauma. So the kinds of things that people report are things like increased anger and irritability, feeling sort of oversensitive, not being able to sleep very easily, perhaps being troubled about, you know, the more extreme end, people experiencing secondary trauma and complex PTSD, so things like intrusive cues, flashbacks, or might find themselves trying to avoid reminders that remind them of, avoid going to places that remind them of certain things, or avoid watching things. I think the other element of, if you're working specifically with young people, is you could start associating, or we start dehumanizing the group that we're most often finding ourselves called out to see. So if it's young people, if there's a higher prevalence of, I think this accounts for some of the reported racism in the police in the past, that actually if you're often getting called to areas where there was a lot of black people represented, then people don't process that actually this is only a small number of a population. And so I think the same happens with young people. You can find yourself feeling like despondent about the youth of today, feeling frightened for our own children. If you've got kids, then it's quite scary to be exposed to the dangerous side of adolescence, which I think is what a lot of people found quite alarming about the programme Adolescence, the Netflix drama. I think that gave people a bit of a shock, like, good God, is this what my kids are facing every day? Rather than recognizing we get quite a skewed picture of society when we're working in these kind of positions.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then also I think you can end up with kind of like people using things like drink to cope, having, feeling dislocated from their partners, so ended up having more conflict at home. I don't think it's any surprise at all that first responders are at a higher risk of divorce than people doing some other jobs, because of the strains and pressure of the work.
Naomi, could I get you to really just unpack some of the interventions that you use in practice just to break this cycle of violence, that you have anecdotally experienced when practicing in prisons or indeed in society? Is there any sort of either evidence-based interventions or anecdotal interventions that really work to break this cycle of violence?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think firstly, sort of, developing a feeling of safe, helping them develop a feeling of safety. And I think as professionals, we often assume that, I'm a good person, I'm doing a caring vocational job, so people know that I mean well. But, for these people, they've often been raised in families where their own parents didn't love them, or weren't able to express love, and weren't able to keep them safe. So if your own parents can't keep you safe, why should you, Owen, the paramedic, be somebody that they can trust or engage with? So I think often acknowledging that lack of trust is really, really important. I think that can be a bit of a curveball for people, because it helps them to say, okay, well, this guy's got a clue about what's going on here. I would always talk about fear. If I felt frightened, it's not going to change what I actually do. I would still approach the conversation, but I might be saying to somebody, the way you're talking to me right now, I find it quite frightening. And sometimes young people, they don't have a sense of their power and volition. So, actually pointing out, come on, we can't engage in this as long as you're behaving in a way that's frightening. I need you to calm down. Just naming and putting that on the table what that is, and thinking about, too often I think we try and pump ourselves up when we're frightened, and then of course you end up in this awful one-upmanship, which if somebody's got a weapon, you are not going to be more powerful than them, and you're not going to want to take the risks that they will take, because you lose your professional registration, so you can't afford to get into a one-upmanship. And too often I've heard prisoners, for instance, swear and say fuck off, and the staff members start getting back into it, well, no, you fuck off, and this row escalates, and that doesn't get anyone anywhere. I think much better to acknowledge the fact that the person is hacked off, or is feeling frightened, and say, come on, let's tone things down a bit, and let's try and find a way forward. And then, have over 25 years of working with people in all dimensions of the criminal justice system. So whether that be in community forensic teams, low secure prisons and mental health units, high secure, I've never met anybody who didn't have a history of trauma and neglect in those places. And so actually, if we want a different society, we have to start thinking about trauma and healing it much earlier. Actually, it's much easier to heal sort of 10 or 15 years of trauma than it is to start trying to work with a 40, 50-year-old man who's had a whole lifetime building on that sort of pattern, and trauma tending to be quite cumulative. We want to find ways to include people, not marginalise them. And a lot of people, if they've experienced violence and neglect within the family home, and perhaps been ejected from school because they've been acting out in a school environment, what we've given these kids is messages that you don't belong in society. We don't care, and you don't belong in society. And it's a very fine line between the point where somebody stops being a victim and then we start demonising them and seeing them as monsters. I mean, even if you think about it, the young boys who killed Jamie Bulger were 10 years old, and you see other incidents of very similar nature we've had more recently. But actually, we're talking about 10-year-old children, and yet we talk about them as evil monsters. And certainly the press, certain aspects of the press like to depict them in that way. I think if we want people to obey the rules of society, i.e., respect one another, be kind and compassionate, don't break the laws of the land, then we want people to feel like they belong to society too. And if they don't feel like they belong, what's in it for them to follow those rules? So, strategies and interventions that marginalise them further, I don't find helpful at all. And I think it's sad that with the austerity measures, actually, young people's services were absolutely decimated in that. And actually, the people that need those services. Those services contribute a lot towards preventing people from ending up in bigger, deep water in the justice system. And they need access to, well, boys need access, and girls actually, but boys more so need access to strong male role models. And I love initiatives like Band of Brothers, where they engage, adult males to go on these initiation weekends and work with young people to show them that Owen the paramedic, John the firefighter, all these different role models of men living ordinary, decent lives, rather than just listening to toxic masculinity rants on social media. What we want people to see is, all right, how can I do masculinity? What is a different way to do it? It doesn't have to be about power and status that's acquired through violence.
Just how do healthcare professionals deal with bearing witness to an increased level of violence on their shifts, either day shifts or night shifts or late shifts? How would you recommend that they deal with, just bearing witness to violent crime?
Well, I think, firstly, I think even talking about it is a big deal, because actually that can contribute something to a culture where it's normalised that this kind of work takes its toll on people. And I think you actually have to work really hard to counteract having a negative impact is the norm. And so you have to put a lot of effort into counteracting that negative impact. I think having a really good support network and organisations that work to encourage that kind of support. Because our natural tendency when we feel frightened or upset is to perhaps retreat and withdraw, which is the worst thing for us, leading to isolation. We do much better when we're connecting with others. But we need to know that if we share the fact that we felt frightened or upset or whatever in that situation, that people are going to understand us and not mock and scoff. And unfortunately, first responders are notorious for their black humour and that sense of kind of like scoff. And there is a place for that, but actually it is also important that people are able to acknowledge how they really feel, and that's best done by managers role modelling that that they're talking about their feelings, that it's safe to talk about feelings and emotions when we're at work. I don't think it's any surprise we see so many horror stories about the Met Police, for instance, repeatedly appearing to treat people in a very dehumanised way, because I don't think the culture allows for people to talk about their feelings. And if you can't talk about your feelings, then you end up acting them out instead. And we tend to use anger and hate because that makes us feel powerful, whereas the fear, the shame, the sadness, that makes us feel vulnerable. If there's no place for that, then we have to find a way to sort of push through. So, we want environments where there's safety, or as much safety as possible. And when we can't be guaranteed safety, there's an acknowledgement of that. And what you don't want is people doing 5 shifts on the trot where they're sent out to gang violence scenes. What you'd hope to see is a little bit more thinking through of what kind of a week has Owen had this week. Maybe today it'd be better if he was doing this other, going to see the person who's had the heart attack rather than being sent to the scene of an adolescent violent attack. And I think, clinical supervision for therapists actually don't have a significantly higher rate of vicarious trauma. And I think that's because we are expected to routinely talk about our feelings about the work as part of the job. We have to have clinical supervision. And we introduced that into the prison service, and there was in the unit that I worked in, there was a lot of opposition to it to start off with. People saw it as being soft and fluffy, and they didn't know what they would talk about and were worried about looking vulnerable. By making it compulsory to turn up for it, it meant that actually those staff who did want to use it and were open to it were able to make good use of it. And things shifted from a lot of opposition to it to actually people, if their supervision was cancelled, they'd be really quite annoyed that it had been cancelled. They'd be seeking it out. They'd be going to efforts to have it rescheduled. So I think, there is quite a lot that can be done, even within the scope of normal work. But, just that, I think where there's a pressure on us for time, that actually just a culture of being able to talk and check in with people and being open about the sorts of emotions that it's normal to feel frightened when you're faced with a knife, or normal to feel sad when you've witnessed somebody seriously injured or even dying as a consequence of some senseless act. If we can't talk about those emotions as normal, then what are we left with? How are we expected to cope with them?
Naomi, could I get you to speak to and really unpack some verbal or non-verbal interventions that you would advocate on scene, just to take the temperature of the room down and just to really de-escalate the scene? Something I very much did as a paramedic and as a clinician was to really put myself into a non-confrontational stance, so not squaring off my shoulders, being nice and calm, very much listening, but also in a way letting them feel they're controlling the conversation, so that there is no contest, there's no confrontation, and certainly just starting to reassure them, bring their own information back into the conversation, and sometimes even sit down with them if that's possible, if that is a possibility. But really starting to take the temperature down, starting to let them know that I'm listening to them, and just affording them that respect. Could I get you to really unpack and speak to what you would advocate?
Yeah, I mean, they were brilliant. They're brilliant interventions that you've just been describing, and I think again they play back to that idea of being much more trauma informed and recognizing that you don't have to get hooked into this power game of proving that you've got more power and more status in the interaction. By deliberately adopting that kind of stance, I think is brilliant. And it's quite old now, but I did write a book chapter or two in a book edited by myself and Des McVeigh, where the book is actually aimed at people delivering services for people with personality disorder, but a lot of the stuff is very relevant to this sort of situation. That actually trying to understand the perspective of the person that you're dealing with, and acknowledge that, actually carrying a knife for that person maybe felt like they had no choice and that was what they needed to do. And it's not a place to be judging at that moment. When emotions are high in the air, actually what you want to be doing is acknowledging that the person who's behaved with violence will also be feeling very, very frightened, and acknowledging the fear and the dangerousness of the situation, but really trying to take their perspective and get alongside them. Anything that in those moments, what you don't want to be seen as is the authoritarian father, which they may have experienced, or the judgmental mother, or vice versa in terms of gender roles. But what you want to be able to be is a neutral figure who offers a possibility of seeing them and understanding where they are in that moment.
So, just pivoting and looking at support, Naomi, could I get you to really unpack and explore some of the support mechanisms in place for frontline staff, such as therapy or indeed trim assessments, and just how that might look on a day-to-day basis for institutions to really optimize the support for frontline staff.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, mentioned already about sort of thinking about the culture, and the managers could be role modeling that by acknowledging and talking about their own emotions about the work. Having discussion about how normal it is to have very strong emotions in response to the kind of work that you're doing. I would say sort of mandating clinical supervision, and that can be done in a group format. That can sometimes be much more powerful, and it might be easier to say, right, everybody has this once a month. We have this hour once a month where we anyone who's on shift engages with this process where we talk about what's going on. I think also we could be monitoring, being support for our colleagues by noticing when they're talking in a way that's disparaging about other people or young people, the people the population that we're there to serve. Actually, if you notice there's a kind of like dehumanizing or disparaging of that population, drawing attention to the fact that isn't how Owen was when he first started working in that role, but there's been this shift over time. That's actually been a really good colleague, not a critical colleague, a really good colleague. Thinking about how duties are allocated, I don't know how much scope there is for that in the job that you're doing, and then working on staff team dynamics. What you want is a staff team who get on, like each other, and have each other's back. And actually, some of the challenges of the work can end up splitting teams. One shift might be seen as a better performing team than another shift, which is really unhelpful and is likely to not be a reflection of reality anyway. And so when those kind of splits emerge, then having some time thinking about that, and even if that's the managers thinking about that and then thinking about what they can do to try and change things. But usually change requires open acknowledgement and discussion rather than sort of just moving people around in order to try and change the dynamics, because that's not likely to change the dynamics at all. And one thing that I think is really, really fascinating actually is making sure there's access to green space. So we know how powerful it is for our well-being anyway, but actually prisons that are surrounded by green space have much lower levels of violence, self-harm, and also have much lower levels of staff sickness. So just having that green space around the prison has a statistically different impact on the people that live and work in the prison. I think that's absolutely incredible. We know that kind of like having a plant in the room, being able to see greenery outside of the window is fantastic, and that again, that's scientifically proven to improve our mental health and help us heal and be more resilient. But actually, even photographs of nature have that effect also. It's not quite as good as a real plant or real green space, but looking at pictures does have a calming effect on our own nervous system. So that doesn't have to be that expensive. That can be quite an easy thing to implement. And then I think also thinking about technology that staff can use on their break to calm their nervous system. There are things like, I mean, I sell something called Rushy Wave glasses, which use flashing light technology to calm your nervous system. There's also Neuroptimal, where staff can, sit and apply the sensors to their head, and that has a calming effect on the nervous system. Perhaps thinking about things like Safe and Sound, which is an auditory program. So there are things that can be done, which, the technology obviously has a little bit of a cost to it, but they're not actually that costly in the scope of NHS budgets at all. And they can be used by multiple people at any time. So,
Naomi, what elements of reframing and I guess in a way contextualizing and perspective gaining can be achieved from clinicians just to, in a way, take these traumatic incidents or the aggregation of incidents over time and really start to make sense of them, really?
well, reframing can be useful, obviously, in terms of, I don't know if you've read Bruce Feiler. Has written a book, Life is in the Transitions, and he talks about growing through adversity. That's the theme of the book, is growing through adversity. And I think actually if people can think about how these experiences contribute to their strength of character and growth as a professional, that can be useful. But I think there are also, real strategies that people can do that from a trauma focused therapy approach that can help with manage our emotions. So, somatic work and starting to focus on what's going on in our bodies. So recognizing we're not that good at recognizing when we feel emotions other than sort of perhaps happiness and joy and pride, but starting to notice, well, all right, how do I Naomi feel when I feel frightened? I notice that I'm pulling back. I can feel a aversion at the thought of going to that particular estate to attend to that particular call out that's been put. So sort of focusing on what we're experiencing and then trying to sit with it and recognize what's going on in our bodies. And there is there's a website devoted to focusing. It's a free strategy that people can develop skills in doing. There's a listening app, a listening program called, and I can share links to all these things, called SEREM, and that uses EMDR to force your attention to your left and right ear while you focus on something. So if you went to an awful call out where somebody had been badly stabbed and you found that you couldn't switch off from it that evening, actually what you could do is listen to this program, and it would encourage you to focus on the stabbing and to allow your attention to wander from your left ear to your right ear. And it seems to have the same effect as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, so the therapy that's known for moving your eyes from side to side. Then also techniques like the emotional freedom technique, which involves tapping on energy pressure points in our body. Again, there's a really good evidence base for that. And trauma release exercises, that was developed by David Bichelli, and it's 7 exercises. And if you do those on a weekly basis, it causes your body to go into a shaking quiver, but which gets rid of stored up tension within your body. So they recommend that people do that on a weekly basis. It takes like 15 minutes to do. So quite simple techniques. And then there's an organisation called heartmath.org, and they also have lots of free resources, and they're focused on really sort of trying to be in a state of emotional coherence when we experience love and compassion and warmth. So thinking about someone you love that matters dearly to you, trying to focus on that for sort of 5 or 10 minutes and noticing how that produces a sense of relaxation in your body, a sense of expansiveness, all of which is incompatible with feeling frightened or stressed. So it can actually be really good for us.
Naomi, is there anything we should keep front of mind when dealing with these calls, just to, in a way, de-escalate our own physiology, de-escalate our own stress on scene?
Well, you said something there that just really reminded me of something very interesting, which is, thinking about how contagious emotions are. And we know that the human energy extends 3 meters out from our body. And so actually, if we are going into scenes and we are full of loving compassion, then actually what we are doing is we are kind of like pouring calm onto a situation. Whereas if we're going all hyped up because we're frightened, actually the energy that we're emitting is just going to escalate and help things spiral. So I think there's something about trying to be conscious of what's going on inside us, noticing how we're feeling, doing a simple body scan and just noticing, oh yeah, I'm feeling quite tense, my shoulders are up, or can I make myself be in more of a mindful state and feel a little bit calmer as I'm going into this situation. But I also think, we really need our colleagues to be also helping us in that and pointing out that actually you're a little bit tetchy tonight, Owen, can you tone it down a little bit? And I loved what you were saying earlier about that sense of sort of calm, taking your voice down a notch. And also it's kind of like removing ego. We can quite easily think, oh, who do you think you are talking to me? I'm doing this job because I want to help people and I want people to be appreciating the fact that I'm trying to do something good, not treating me like they want to fight me. But actually just being able to have a lack of ego and recognize that actually you being a good paramedic is not dependent on what that person that you're going to deal with thinks of you. They can call you whatever they like. Yeah, it's not very nice. It's awful to be denigrated and shouted at and put down. But actually, you're a far better human if you're able to be self-contained. And the people who rise to those kind of comments are often people who've got quite low self-esteem. And so actually somebody putting them down inflames them. And actually, if you're kind of like really in a healthy place and you've got a good sense of confidence in yourself and your own self-worth as a person, it's much easier to manage those situations. So there is something I think about trying to take pride from the moments of success that we have. So, reflect on situations where might have been an awful situation, but that actually you handled that really well. And actually probably that's something that managers could do better, is encouraging people to reflect on what are the wins. It doesn't have to be a perfect outcome in terms of what was the end result for the individual that you went to. The result is actually, how did you manage in that situation, and did you manage to stay calm and not get pulled into the dynamics and the hostility that they were trying to engage you in?
Just as we come into land on the conversation, could I get you to really unpack and explore really any top of mind advice that you would give to clinicians about being able to almost sidestep emotion, certainly visceral emotion, on scene, and really de-escalate your own physiology before it really starts to get the better of you?
Yeah, sure. Because I think actually forewarned is forearmed, and actually the more that we understand something, the easier it is to deal with it. It boosts our resilience, doesn't it? So actually, training around, what are some of the factors that are at play in youth violence, I think could be really helpful for people. I also think clinical supervision. Most psychologists, do understand the nature of how challenging a job there's a lot of admiration and respect for first responders in terms of the difficulties of the jobs. It's well known about the impact in terms of the risk for vicarious trauma. So actually engaging with other services and trying to see what's possible in order to to try and ease the load a bit for staff that are in. Obviously, the NHS is in a bit of a difficulty in terms of what's available. Mental health services don't do well in funding and budgets normally, but actually kind of like pushing for some involvement, I think could be really helpful for first responders.
Naomi, thank you for being with us today. It's fantastic just to get your insights and also really just get your perspectives on this topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. I've really enjoyed the conversation, so much appreciated.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.